The moment that changes everything. Nobody stepped forward for her. Not in the first minute. Not in the fifth. Not in the 11th. She stood on that platform in Coldwater, Texas, in her best dress with her father's tool case at her feet and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and she did not look down. Not once. That was the first thing he noticed about her. He was not supposed to be there for a wife. He had a ranch, a silent daughter who had not spoken in 2 years, and a guilt he had been carrying alone since a night in Abilene that he could never take back. She had a dead husband's debts, a leather tool case, and the hard-won knowledge that wanting things was how you got hurt. Neither of them was looking for what they found. But a child who draws people without mouths has a way of changing the mathematics of a broken heart. And the word that little girl finally speaks one word in a dusty Texas street is going to cost you everything you thought you had left to cry. This channel tells the stories the West was built on. Love that earns itself slowly. Family that does not start with blood. And the kind of courage that looks like a woman sitting down at a workbench and simply refusing to leave. The lesson this story carries is simple, and it is true. The strongest things in this world are not the ones that were never tested. They are the ones that were broken and repaired by someone who knew exactly where the damage was. If that means something to you, subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And leave your city in the comments. I want to see how far a good story can travel.
I had been standing on that platform long enough to count 17 cracks in the boards beneath my feet. 17 cracks. A October wind off the Texas plains that smelled like dust and something older than dust. And the particular silence of a crowd that has already made up its mind and sees no reason to announce it. My name is Clara Weston. I was 32 years old. I had come west from Boston with a leather tool case, one carpet bag, and the working theory that wanting things was how you got hurt. I had learned that theory from my late husband, who had wanted many things, gambled away all of them, and died leaving me with his debts and his last name, and nothing else worth keeping. 8 women had stepped off the Tuesday stage from Amarillo that morning. 8 women had stood on this platform outside the Coldwater, Texas train depot. 7 of them had been chosen inside of 20 minutes. I was the 8th. Coldwater was a small town in the Texas Panhandle that smelled like red dust and coal smoke, and the particular desperation of a place that had been waiting for rain for 2 years and was beginning to accept that the rain might not come. The buildings along Main Street were weatherboard, sun-bleached to the color of old bone. The sky was white, not cloud white, just white the way sky gets when the heat has burned all the color out of it. Reverend Alderson was still talking. He had been talking for 11 minutes. I knew because I had counted those too. Clara Weston, he said again. Age 32, from Boston. Skilled cobbler and leather worker. Of good Christian character and considerable practical ability. Nobody moved. A man near the back of the crowd said something I did not catch, and the people around him laughed the way people laugh when they want to be part of something without taking responsibility for it. I did not look at the man. I looked at the middle distance, which was the particular stretch of flat Texas land that ran north from Coldwater until it met a low range of hills the color of old bruises. I had found in the past 2 years of difficult situations that the middle distance was the most reliable place to put your eyes when you needed to wait something out. Then I heard boots, deliberate, not hurried. The crowd parting the way it parts for a man who moves like he has somewhere to be. He was tall, lean in the way that comes from years of outdoor work and not from any intention. A scar along his left jaw. A hat pulled low. He walked to the front of the crowd, stopped, and looked up at me. He had gray eyes, steady as a level line. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he is deciding about, not appraising, deciding. There is a difference. "What is the asking price?" he said to Reverend Alderson, without taking his eyes off me. The Reverend told him. The man produced a worn leather billfold and counted out the money onto the Reverend's table without ceremony. Then he looked up at me again. "My name is Ryder Callahan," he said. "I have a ranch 8 miles north of town. One daughter, 8 years old. The work is hard, and I will not pretend otherwise. I am not looking for romance. I am looking for someone steady, someone my daughter can rely on. In return, you get a home, fair treatment, and a man who will never once stand in a crowd and find you wanting. That is my offer. It is your choice." The square had gone very quiet. I looked at the money on the table. I looked at the crowd of people who had spent 11 minutes making me feel like something left on the side of a road. I looked at Ryder Callahan, who was still watching me with those level gray eyes and no expression that told me what answer he was hoping for. I said, "I accept." My voice came out steady. I had worked on that, the steadiness. 2 years of lawyers and debt collectors had taught me that a steady voice was the only armor that cost nothing. He picked up my tool case before I could reach for it. "We will get your other bag from the depot," he said. "Do you need to say goodbye to anyone?" "There is no one to say goodbye to," I said. He nodded once, like that answer made sense to him in a way that required no examination, and turned to walk toward his wagon. I followed him. Behind us, I heard the crowd begin to talk again. I did not look back. The ride north took 2 hours. Ryder Callahan drove with the ease of a man who had made this trip several hundred times and saw no reason to narrate it. I sat on the bench beside him with my carpet bag on my lap and my tool case wedged between my feet, where I could feel the weight of it. That tool case had belonged to my father. He had been a cobbler for 30 years in Boston, and he had put a hammer and an awl into my hands when I was 8 years old and said, "Eleanor, when you know how to make something hold, nobody can take that from you." His name for me was Eleanor. My husband had called me Clara, which was my middle name, and I had kept it after he died because starting over required at least one thing that felt like a choice. The land north of Coldwater was wide and pale and indifferent to human presence in the specific way of country that has been here long before anyone arrived, and intends to remain long after everyone leaves. I had never seen country like it. Boston had buildings in every direction, always something to stop your eye. Here, the eye could travel for what felt like forever before it found something to rest on. I found this either terrifying or magnificent. I had not yet decided which. After 30 minutes of silence, Ryder said, "My daughter's name is Emmy. She is 8 years old. She does not speak." I turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road. "She has not spoken since her mother died," he said, 2 years ago. 3 doctors. No physical cause found. I said, "Does she understand what is said to her?" Ryder said, "Everything." I said, "Then I will be careful what I say." He glanced at me sideways. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, more like a man who had set his expectation at a certain level and found it exceeded and was recalibrating. The ranch came into view as we crested the last rise. Substantial. 3 main buildings around a central yard. A barn big enough to shelter 20 horses. Fencing that ran in clean lines as far as I could see. The main house was 2 stories, log construction, wide porch, smoke from 2 chimneys. "The fencing is straight," I said. He looked at me. I said, "Someone built this to last. That is not the work of a man who has given up." He looked at the fence line for a moment. "Grace," he said, "that was my wife's name. She died 2 years ago. I have been doing the work of 2 people since." He said it the way a man states a fact he has stated many times until the words have worn smooth and no longer catch on anything. I did not say I was sorry. He did not look like a man who found that useful. We pulled into the yard, and that was how it began. Emmy Callahan was sitting in the corner of the main room when I came through the door. She sat very straight in a wooden chair with a sketchbook across her knees and a pencil in her hand, and she did not look up. She had her father's coloring, dark hair, gray eyes, but where Ryder's stillness read as deliberate, hers read as practiced. The stillness of a child who had learned that being unnoticed was safer than being seen. Ryder set my bags down. "Emmy," he said, "this is Miss Weston. She will be staying with us." Emmy did not look up. Ryder looked at me once, the look of a man handing something fragile to someone he was not yet certain of, and went back outside. I stood in the main room of the Callahan ranch house and took stock. Large kitchen through an open doorway, a fireplace on the west wall with ash in it that needed cleaning, a workbench under the south window where the light would be good in the morning, 2 armchairs, a braided rug that had been expensive once, and in the corner, a small girl drawing in a sketchbook like I was not there. I did not go to her. I did not speak to her. I set my tool case on the kitchen table, opened it, and began reorganizing the contents. This was a thing I did when I needed to steady myself. The familiar weight of each tool, the awls in the leather roll, the lasting pliers, the curved needle for uppers, everything in its place. After 20 minutes, Emmy moved her chair 3 inches closer to the kitchen doorway. I kept working, did not acknowledge it, did not look up. My father had once told me that earning trust from a damaged creature was not about making them come to you. It was about making yourself worth coming to. That evening before bed, I left one of my smaller awls on the table near where Emmy had been sitting, not as an invitation, just within reach. In the morning, it had been moved 2 inches. A small circle had been pressed into the leather scrap beside it. She had been practicing. I filed that away like a piece of good leather found in poor condition. Salvageable. Possibly. The first dinner was the particular agony of 3 people who do not know each other's rhythms. Ryder cooked without being asked, a plain meal, efficient. Emmy sat at her corner of the table and ate without looking at either of us. I ate and watched neither of them, obviously. I said, "What was her name, your wife?" Ryder said, "Grace." Then he stood, took his plate, and went outside. I sat with Emmy. After a moment, Emmy turned her sketchbook so I could see the page she was working on. A woman in a kitchen drawn from behind. No face visible. I did not know if it was me or her mother. I suspected Emmy did not fully know either. I said, "That is good work. Your proportions are right." Emmy looked at me. It was the first time she had looked directly at me since I arrived. Her eyes were her father's exactly. Then she turned the sketchbook back and kept drawing. The house had a room I was not supposed to enter. I found it on the second day, the master bedroom at the end of the upstairs hall, door slightly ajar. I looked in from the doorway without going through. Women's dresses on the rack, a hairbrush on the dresser, a cedar chest at the foot of the bed, lid not quite closed. Through the gap in the lid, I could see a pair of women's boots, Sunday boots from the look of the leather, dark brown, good quality once. The left heel had detached completely. They had been placed in the chest rather than thrown away. I closed the door, did not go in. That night, I took my father's cobbling journal from my bag and read the same page I always read when I needed steadying. His handwriting, his instructions on reading worn leather, when to repair, when to replace, and how to tell the difference. I wrote in the margin in my own hand, "The thing about a house that has held grief for a long time is that it knows how to hold things. The question is whether it can learn to hold something different." 3 days in, I understood Ryder's language. He did not say things, he did things. He repaired the broken rung on the kitchen chair without comment, the one I had been avoiding sitting on. He left the lamp oil filled each morning before I came downstairs. He adjusted the south window so it latched properly without being asked, because he had noticed me fighting it. None of this was announced. None of it was performed. It simply appeared, the way things appear when someone is paying attention without making a point of it. I noticed. I said nothing. I filed it. On the 4th morning, Emmy passed me a folded scrap of paper during breakfast. I opened it when she was not looking. One word in careful pencil letters, "Stay." I put it in my apron pocket. Did not take it out until I was alone that evening. Held it in both hands for longer than I would have admitted to anyone. One word, 8 years old. She had sized up the full situation and reduced it to its essential request. I found this more persuasive than anything her father had said to me. That same week, a farmer named Hank Morris came to the ranch with a notice from the county land office. A lien from 1864, he said, reactivated. He did not know what it meant. He had nowhere else to bring it. I read it. I knew exactly what it meant. 2 years of fighting lawyers in Boston had taught me to read documents like this the way my father had taught me to read leather. By pressure, by where the wear was, by what was being hidden in plain language. I said, "How many other families have received something like this?" Hank Morris looked at his boots, which were in poor condition and needed resoling. He said, "I don't rightly know, ma'am. A few, I think." That evening, I asked Ryder about it. He sat with the notice for a long time. Then he said, "I have heard of 2 others, the Morris place and the Alcott family east of town. I said I would like to go to town tomorrow, if that is agreeable. I need to resupply some materials." He said, "I will drive you." I said, "I think I would like to go alone this time." He looked at me. I said, "I will take the bay mare if she is available." He said, "She is?" He said nothing else. But he was up before me in the morning, and the mare was saddled and waiting. That was how Ryder Callahan said yes. Coldwater on a Tuesday morning was dust and weatherboard, and the low hum of a town that was slightly smaller than it had been the year before. 3 businesses on Main Street had closed since summer. I could tell by the paper in the windows and the particular quiet of storefronts that had stopped expecting customers. I tied the mare at the post outside the boarding house and went in. Maggie Ford was behind the front desk with a ledger and a cup of coffee, and the expression of a woman who had been running this establishment long enough that she could size up a new arrival in under 10 seconds and usually be right. She said, "You are the cobbler, Ryder Callahan's wife." I said, "I am the cobbler. The other part is still being determined." Maggie Ford looked at me for one additional second and then laughed. A real laugh, sudden and genuine. She said, "Sit down. I will put fresh coffee on." Maggie Ford was 55 years old, and she knew everything that happened in Coldwater, which was not unusual for a woman who ran the only boarding house in town. What was unusual was that she knew which of it mattered and which of it did not, and she had the discipline to only deploy what was relevant. She told me who the reliable merchants were and which ones she would avoid. She told me that Hank Morris was not the only farmer who had received a county notice, that there were at least 6 others that she knew of, possibly more that had not yet been discussed openly. She said, "People in this town are afraid to compare notes. They each think they are the only one, or they are afraid that saying it out loud makes it more real." I said, "Who is filing the notices?" Maggie poured coffee into a second cup and set it in front of me. She said, "That is what nobody has been able to establish clearly. The notices come from a land holding company registered in Denver. Nobody local seems to know who owns it." I said, "And the judge?" Maggie looked at me carefully. She said, "Warren Cole has been on the Coldwater bench for 9 years. He is well liked by people who have not needed to oppose him. He is currently pursuing an appointment to the federal bench, which would make him considerably more powerful and considerably more difficult to challenge." She paused. She said, "He came to see you this morning. He left 10 minutes before you arrived." I said, "He does not know me." Maggie said, "He knows who rode the Tuesday stage from Amarillo. In a town this size, that information takes about 4 hours to reach anyone who wants it." I sat with that. Maggie said, "He will come to introduce himself. He always introduces himself to newcomers. He will bring a gift." I said, "What kind of gift?" She said, "Something useful and slightly more expensive than appropriate for a first meeting. That is his signature. The hand that gives first is the hand that intends to own you." I filed that away. I spent the rest of the morning meeting people. The dry goods merchant, the blacksmith, Ruth Alcott, who came to the door of her house when she saw me pass, and said she had heard I was a cobbler, and did I do children's boots because her youngest had a sole coming apart, and the supply store wanted $2 for a new pair, and she did not have $2 right now, her husband having been laid up since the mining injury. I went inside and looked at the boot. I said, "The sole is still good. The adhesive failed and the stitching pulled through on this side. I can reset it and restitch the welt. It will hold another winter." Ruth Alcott said, "What do I owe you?" I said, "Nothing for this one." If it holds through winter and you want the other boot maintained in spring, we will talk about trade then. She looked at me with the expression of a woman deciding whether an offer of help was charity in disguise, which she did not want, or something else. I said, I am not offering charity. I am establishing a working relationship. She said, all right then. I was on my way back to the mayor when Judge Warren Cole came around the corner of the Mercantile. He was exactly as Maggie's description had prepared me for. Tall, impeccably dressed without being ostentatious, hair silver at the temples, a handshake that had been practiced to the point of becoming genuinely convincing. Mrs. Callahan, he said, what a pleasure to finally meet you. Coldwater is fortunate to have a skilled tradesperson of your caliber. I said, Miss Weston, I have not changed my name. A small pause. The smile did not waver. He said, of course, my apologies. He produced a pair of leather gloves from the inside pocket of his coat. Beautiful things. Butter soft. More expensive than anything I had seen in a Coldwater storefront. He said, a small welcome from the community. I took them. Said thank you. Said I needed to get back to the ranch before dark. His eyes held mine for 1 second longer than necessary. I said, it was very nice to meet you, Judge. I rode the 8 miles back to the ranch with the gloves in my saddlebag and my mind running the same calculation the entire way. Victoria Harlow appeared at the dry goods store just as I was leaving town. I had almost missed her. Sky blue dress, composed in the way of a woman who has rehearsed this exact encounter. She looked at me with a frank, measuring look. Then she nodded precisely and went inside. That evening I said to Maggie, who had walked with me to where the mare was tied, who is Victoria Harlow? Maggie tied her apron strings tighter. She said, the woman Ryder Callahan had an understanding with before you arrived. I said, what kind of understanding? Maggie said, the kind a small town treats as an engagement even when nothing has been formally said. She has been waiting for him to settle his grief and come back to the practical business of his life. She paused. She said, there is one more thing you should know. Victoria Harlow is Judge Cole's niece. I stood very still. Maggie said, her presence near the Callahan Ranch has never been accidental. Cole has been managing that relationship for 2 years since Grace died. He is a patient man, and he plays a long game. I rode home and put the leather gloves in the drawer I did not use. Then I sat at my workbench in the south window and thought about long games and the people who played them, and whether or not the people who did not play them had any chance at all. Outside, the wind came off the Texas plains and pressed against the windows, and Emmy drew quietly at the kitchen table, and Ryder came in from the barn and set a cup of coffee beside my elbow without a word, and went back to his chair. I looked at the coffee. I looked at the drawer where the gloves were. Some gifts cost everything, I thought, and some cost nothing at all. The working relationship between Ryder Callahan and me developed the way leather develops when it is properly maintained, slowly through consistent attention, without dramatic announcement. He woke at 5 in the morning. I was usually already up. We did not talk much at that hour. We moved around the kitchen with the careful choreography of 2 people learning each other's patterns, who moves where, who takes which side of the stove when silence is comfortable and when it requires filling. It was usually comfortable. Emmy ate breakfast with us every morning and then took her sketchbook to the south window where the light was good. She had begun, without being asked, to bring her drawings to show me after I finished my morning work. She would set the sketchbook open on my workbench and wait. I always looked, always said something honest. Not a compliment for the sake of it. Something specific. On Wednesday of the second week, she set a drawing in front of me that stopped my hands. It was my portrait, not a quick sketch. A careful, studied drawing that had taken real time. She had drawn me laughing. I had not laughed once since arriving at the ranch. Not genuinely. She had drawn what she expected, not what she had seen. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at Emmy. She was watching me with those steady gray eyes, her father's eyes exactly, waiting to see if she had done something wrong. I said, this is excellent work. The proportions are right and the line quality is consistent. Do you know how rare that is at your age? Emmy looked at the drawing, then back at me. Something relaxed in her shoulders. I pinned it above my workbench with a small tack. It stayed there. The second week also brought 3 neighbors to the ranch door, all of them with broken leather goods that needed attention. Word traveled fast in small country. The woman who fixed boots for free and did not make you feel lesser for needing it. That kind of thing got around. I set up a proper work rotation. Mornings for the ranch's own leather needs, afternoons for neighbors who came to the door. I never charged money. I let the network build itself. It was on a Thursday afternoon, while I was restitching a bridle that had been allowed to dry out through summer, that Ryder said, "I will show you the horses tomorrow, if you want to learn to ride properly." I said, "I can ride adequately." He said, "Adequately is not the same as safely. Out here, it matters." The lesson happened on Friday morning in the open field north of the barn. He rode alongside me first, demonstrating. Then he moved his horse close to mine, too close for propriety, and reached over to adjust my hands on the reins. His hands were over mine for about 6 seconds. Neither of us said anything for a moment after he moved back. The horse, entirely indifferent to human complications, did exactly as trained. We rode for an hour. At the end, without planning it, I let the bay mare run at full pace across the flat ground north of the corral, and the speed of it, the wind and the wide sky, and the particular freedom of moving faster than anything had let me move in years, came out of me as laughter. Genuine, unguarded, the kind that arrives without permission. I pulled up and turned and found Ryder had stopped his horse and was watching me. He was not moving. His hat was back slightly, and he had the expression of a man who has just seen something he was not prepared for and is deciding where to put it. He did not say anything. I did not say anything. We rode back to the barn in the comfortable silence that had by now become its own kind of conversation. That evening, after Emmy was in bed, Ryder found me at the corral fence watching the last light leave the sky. He leaned on the fence beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him in the October air. He said, "Emmy's mother, Grace." She laughed like that. Out of nowhere. I said nothing. He said, "I had forgotten that sound was possible until today." I looked at the horizon. He looked at it too. He said, "I am not telling you that to make you feel something. I am telling you because it is true, and I have not said a true thing to another person in longer than I can remember." I said, "I understand the difference." He said, "I know you do. That is why I said it." We stood there until the last of the light was gone. At Maggie's the next morning, over my weekly supply run, Maggie told me she had 6 names now, 6 families who had received county notices. She had quietly asked around carefully, the way she gathered all information through the natural channels of a woman who ran the place people slept and ate and talked. I said, "Does Dallas Reed know about this?" Maggie said, "Dallas Reed is Ryder's closest friend and a good man." She paused the way she paused when there was something more she was weighing. I said, "But?" She said, "But Dallas owes people things, the way men in small towns accumulate debts that do not show up in ledgers. I would be thoughtful about what you bring to him and when." I said, "Is he honest?" Maggie said, "He is trying to be, which is different from being honest, and also, sometimes, harder." I rode back to the ranch with 6 names in my head and the particular feeling of a problem whose shape was becoming visible. It had a shape I recognized. It was the same shape the problem in Boston had had, just wearing different clothes. You could fight a problem once you could see its shape. The question was whether you could see it fast enough. The 3rd week at the Callahan Ranch, I began to believe I might be staying. This was a dangerous thing to begin to believe, and I knew it, which is why I noticed it. Emmy had started speaking again. Not to everyone, only to me, and only in very small sentences. Functional things: the right needle is in the second roll, the brown horse has a stone in its hoof, I do not want porridge again. Each sentence landed on Ryder like something physical. He absorbed them without showing it. I watched him absorb them and said nothing. There was a morning when I was working at my bench and Emmy came and sat beside me close enough that our arms touched and did not move away. We stayed like that for an hour. Neither of us commented on it. That hour was the best hour I had had in 2 years. On the Thursday of the third week, Ryder and I rode together to the east pasture to check fence. It was cold, the first real cold of October, and the sky had that pewter quality that meant the season was making a decision. We rode side by side. After a while he said, "Tell me about Boston." I said, "What do you want to know?" He said, "What you did there before you answered the advertisement." I told him about my father's cobbling shop, about learning the trade when I was 8, about my husband briefly, just the facts of it, the gambling and the debts and the lawyers, about the 2 years of fighting to salvage something and failing, and eventually deciding that salvaging meant starting somewhere entirely new. He listened without interrupting, which was the mark of someone who understood that the time to ask questions was after you had all the information. When I finished, he said, "Your husband. Did he know what you were worth?" I said, "He knew what he could get." Ryder looked at the fence line. He said, "That is not the same thing." I said, "No, it is not. That was all." But it was enough. The thing I found in the desk drawer happened on a Friday afternoon. Ryder was in the barn. Emmy was at her window. I was looking for a sheet of paper to write out the supply list for the following week and pulled open the second drawer of the desk in the main room. The supply paper was there. Under it was a folded newspaper clipping. Under that was a handwritten list. Names. Women's names. Each with brief notes beside them. Mine was halfway down. Clara Weston. Cobbler. Widow. No family remaining. Practical. Self-sufficient. No family remaining. I read it twice. Then I set it on the kitchen table and sat down and waited for Ryder to come in from the barn. He came in 40 minutes later, pulled off his coat, and stopped when he saw the paper on the table. He sat down across from me. I said, "You chose me because I had nowhere to go back to." He said, "I chose you because you were capable, because Emmy needed someone stable." I said, "You chose me because a woman with nothing left has no reason to leave. You needed something permanent and you selected accordingly." He said, "Yes." He did not look away. He said, "I am not going to tell you that was right. It was not right. But it was what I did." I said, "So when you walked up to that platform, when you put money on the Reverend's table and said, 'I will never stand in a crowd and find you wanting,'" I stopped. He said, "I meant every word of that." I said, "But you had already calculated that I was safe, that I was useful, and had nowhere else to go." He said, "Both things can be true." I said, "Yes, they can, and both things are." I stood up. I picked up my tool case. I walked to the door. Emmy was on the stairs. She had heard everything, the way children hear everything from stairs. She watched me cross to the door, her hands pressed flat on the wall beside her. She did not call out. Her face in that moment was a thing I will not try to describe. Some things are larger than words. I rode to Maggie's. Maggie put tea down and did not ask a single question, which was the kindest thing she could have done. I sat at her kitchen table and thought about what it meant to be chosen for your usefulness rather than yourself, and whether those two things could ever, with enough time and enough honesty, become the same. I had made one rule for myself after my husband died. Never again mistake being needed for being wanted. I had broken it in under 3 weeks. I was efficient, if nothing else, at repeating my own mistakes. Outside the boarding house window, cold water went about its business in the early evening light. A man I did not know was nailing something to the post outside the land office. A woman was calling a child in from the street. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow I will decide what I am going to do. I did not know that tomorrow everything would change twice. First, in a way that broke me open with something I had no name for, and then in a way that broke me open with something I did not know how to survive. I stayed at Maggie's for 3 days. Ryder did not come. But every morning there was something on the front step. Day 1. A jar of the particular leather oil I used on dry hide, the good kind, the kind from the saddler in Amarillo that I had mentioned once in passing. Day 2. A box of stitching needles, the heavy gauge I ran out of first. Day 3, a single dried cattail from the creek laid across the top of the needle box. No note, no signature, as if the things had simply appeared. I waited until I heard his horse leave before I went to the door. I told myself I was being dignified. I was lying. On the morning of the 4th day, Victoria Harlow came to Maggie's kitchen. She sat down across from me with the composure of a woman who has rehearsed this but decided to set the script aside. She said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to understand it is not said for any particular outcome. It is said because I am tired of being graceful about something that does not require grace." I said, "All right." She said, "I never had what you think I had with Ryder Callahan. He was kind to me. He is kind to most people when he remembers to try. But he looked at me the way a man looks at something reasonable. He looks at you like he's trying to memorize something before it disappears. I noticed that in the first 10 seconds. She stood. She said, "Whatever you're going to do, I thought you should know that." She left. I sat with it for a long time. Then I heard small boots on Maggie's front porch. I went to the door. Emmy was standing on the step. She had walked into town alone, 4 miles on the Coldwater Road. She was holding her sketchbook. I said, "Emmy, how did you get here?" She held up the sketchbook, open to a new drawing. Clara and Emmy at a table, a roof above them, a chimney with smoke. On the chimney, in very careful pencil letters, the word home. I came down to her level, crouched on the bottom step so we were eye to eye. I waited. Emmy opened her mouth. Nothing came. The wind moved down the street and lifted a little dust. A horse shifted at the post down the block, then small as a match being struck in a dark room. Mama. I did not move. She looked at me uncertain, checking, needing to know if she had done the right thing. I pulled her in. Both arms, held her. She held on too. I had not cried since my husband's funeral. I did not cry now. I held that child, and I felt something I had no name for, that was larger than grief and larger than joy, and was perhaps simply the weight of finally being somewhere you are needed, in the exact shape you are. After a long time, I became aware of someone standing in the street, Ryder. He had followed her at a distance close enough to help if she needed it. He stood 20 yards away with his hat in his hands and his shoulders doing something he had not let them do in 2 years. He had watched his daughter speak. He had watched her choose someone to speak to. I looked at him across the distance. He looked back. I stood up, keeping Emmy's hand in mine. Ryder walked over. He looked at his daughter, and then at me, and then somewhere past both of us, at the particular middle distance that men look at when they are feeling something they do not have words for. Then he said, "Clara." I said, "Come inside." We went into Maggie's kitchen. Emmy fell asleep on the settee within 20 minutes, exhausted from the emotion of the walk and the words. We sat across from each other at Maggie's kitchen table. Ryder said, "I chose you off a list. That is true. But I need you to understand why I chose you. I needed someone who was already whole. I could not give Emmy someone who needed fixing. I needed to give her someone who already knew how to stand." He looked at his hands. He said, "I chose you because you were already enough." I was too clumsy to say it like that. I said it wrong from the beginning. I said, "Yes, you did." He said, "I know." I said, "But I am listening to the right version now." He looked up. I said, "I am not back, not yet, but I am listening." He reached across the table, his hand open, palm up. An offer, not a demand. I looked at it. Then I put my hand in his. It was not forgiveness. It was not a beginning. It was something in between, which is sometimes where the most honest things live. Then the back door of Maggie's kitchen opened and Dallas Reed came in. He did not look at Ryder. He set an envelope on the table. He said, "I am sorry you would have found it eventually. Better for me." He went back out. I looked at the envelope. I opened it. A Pinkerton field report. Abilene, Kansas, March of 1873. A raid on a suspected weapons cache. Wrong address confirmed after entry. One civilian casualty. Name of deceased, Thomas Barrett. Age 34, unarmed. Name of lead agent on record, R. Callahan. I read it once. Thomas Barrett had been my maiden name. I had taken my husband's name at 22, and the world had called me Clara Weston ever since. Thomas Barrett had been my older brother, the one who remembered my birthday without being reminded, the one who whistled while he worked, the one whose grave I had never been able to afford to visit because by the time I had the money, the debts had taken it. I read it again. The kitchen was very quiet. Ryder was looking at me. He knew. I could see that he knew. Not specifically, but he knew something had arrived that was going to change the shape of everything. I said, he liked his coffee black. He could not carry a tune, but he hummed anyway. He taught me to tie my boots. He never once forgot my birthday. Ryder said nothing. I said, he was 34 years old when he died. He had a wife. She remarried 2 years later. I never blamed her. Ryder said nothing. I said, Thomas Barrett was my brother. The silence in the kitchen had a weight that could be measured. I stood up. I walked outside. I stood in the middle of the Coldwater Street in the October afternoon, and I looked at the flat Texas sky, and I breathed. The man who had chosen me off a list had put a bullet through my brother in the dark in Abilene 6 years ago by accident, and had been carrying it in silence ever since. I did not know which of those things was breaking me more. I did not know whether I was angrier or more devastated or more exhausted by the specific cruelty of the world, which seemed determined to connect every wound I had ever had to every wound I had not yet finished healing. I stood there for a long time. Then I felt something at my feet. Emmy had come to the doorway. She had dropped her sketchbook into the street from the threshold. It lay open at my feet, open to the drawing that said home. I picked it up, held it. Did not go back inside yet, but held it. I stayed at Maggie's for 5 more days. I worked. I thought. I talked to Maggie in the careful way women talk when they are not ready to say the real thing, but cannot bear complete silence. Maggie said on the 3rd day, forgiveness is not something you feel first. It is something you decide first. The feeling catches up later, usually when you are not paying attention. I said, I know that. I just need time to decide. She said, you have it. Take what you need. I visited Emmy every day. Not Ryder, just Emmy. I sat with her at my old bench under the south window and worked on a small leather bracelet I was making for her. She sat beside me, close enough that our arms touched, and sketched. On the 3rd visit, she showed me a drawing she had made the night before. A man at a kitchen table, alone. His hands flat on the wood in front of him. Behind him, a small girl with her arms around his shoulders, her cheek against the back of his head. Both figures had mouths. Neither was speaking, but both had eyes that were open. I looked at the drawing for a long time. I said, when did this happen? Emmy pointed to the floor, downstairs, nighttime. I said, was he all right? She considered this. Then she drew one more thing in the margin of the page. A small figure standing up from a table, moving toward a door. He got up, I said. She nodded. He gets up, I said. She nodded again with more certainty. On the 5th day, I rode back to the ranch. Not to forgive. Not to begin again. To be present, which is not the same thing, and I knew it. Ryder was in the yard when I came in. He did not come toward me. He waited. I tied the mare. I walked over to where he was standing. I said, I want to tell you about Thomas. Not the report. Him. What he was like, if you are willing to hear it. He said, I am. We sat on the porch step. I told him 3 stories. Told him. The birthday he drove through a snowstorm to bring me a pair of boots I had admired in a shop window. The argument we had the last time I saw him, stupid and small, about something I cannot even remember now. The way he used to make tea, always too strong, and add cream to thin it out, and say the same thing every time. Perfect. Ryder listened the way a man listens when he is trying to carry something alongside someone else. Not to fix it, just to share the load. When I finished, he said, "He sounds like someone who should have had more time." I said, "Yes." Then I said, "I am not ready to forgive you. I want you to understand that I mean that, but I am also not ready to leave." He said, "I will take that." Then I said, "Tell me what happened. All of it, not the report version." He looked at the mountains for a long time. Then he told me. The wrong address confirmed too late. The dark. The movement that looked like a weapon. The sound that came after. He had been 29 years old. He had resigned the next morning. He had never had a drink since that night. He had carried the report in a drawer for 6 years because throwing it away felt like a second erasure. He said, "There is nothing I can say that is sufficient." I said, "No, there is not. But I asked you to tell me, and you told me the truth. That is not nothing." A silence, the kind with something working through it. He said, "I chose a woman off a list, and she turned out to be the sister of the man I killed. I do not know what to do with that." I said, "Neither do I. We will figure it out. Or we will not. But we will do it honestly." He touched the brim of his hat. That gesture, I had come to understand, was what he did when he did not have words. When the thing he was feeling was larger than language. I understood. I was beginning to speak his language. On the way back from town 2 days later, Maggie pulled me aside and handed me a letter. She said, "From my contact in Austin. I have been waiting on this for 2 weeks." I read it on her front step. And I understood for the first time what Emmy had been carrying and what Warren Cole was actually afraid of. I read the letter twice on Maggie's front step, and then folded it carefully and put it in my coat pocket and rode back to the ranch faster than I had ridden anything in my life. Ryder was at the corral. I came in at a pace that told him something had changed. He said, "What happened?" I said, "Come inside. Both of us need to be sitting down for this." We sat at the kitchen table. Emmy was upstairs. I put the letter between us. He read it. His jaw went through its tightening sequence. He looked up. I said, "Cole killed a man in 1871. A rancher named George Aldridge who refused to sell his land. It was staged as a robbery. The investigation was brief and inconclusive because the judge overseeing it was a friend of Cole's." Ryder said, "Who was the witness?" I said, "Emmy." He was very still. I said, "She was 6 years old. She was at her aunt's ranch for the weekend, and she wandered into the barn at the wrong moment, and she saw what she saw." Ryder said nothing. I said, "Grace came to collect her the next day. Your wife found out what Emmy had seen. She was trying to figure out what to do about it. 3 months later, Grace died in a riding accident. Maggie's contact has doubts about whether it was an accident." The kitchen was very quiet. Ryder stood up. He went to the window and stood with his back to me. I could see his hands on the windowsill. I said, "Emmy did not stop speaking because of grief. She stopped speaking because she had seen a man murdered and then watched her mother run out of time to do anything about it, and some part of her understood in the way children understand things they cannot articulate that speaking about what she had seen was dangerous. She went silent the way an animal goes still when it knows it is being hunted." Ryder said, "Cole's federal appointment." I said, "Yes. The review process will include a background investigation. He has moved up his timeline because of it. He needs this resolved before the review board convenes in 6 weeks. Ryder turned around. His face had the quality it got when he had moved past the emotion into the decision on the other side of it. He said, "The land notices are a cover. He is pressuring families to keep them occupied and frightened and looking inward so they do not look at him." I said, "Yes." He said, "And if Emmy ever speaks." I said, "She is the only living witness to a murder. She is 8 years old, and she is beginning to speak again. That is the thing he cannot afford." We looked at each other across the table. He said, "What do we do?" I noticed he said, "we." I said, Maggie has a contact. A federal deputy sheriff in Amarillo named Archer Hayes. I need to write to him tonight, and I need to tell him everything we have. All of it. The notices, the connection to Cole's holding company, the witness, the murder. Everything at once. He said, "It will take time for Hayes to get here." I said, "I know, which means we need to move Emmy before Cole understands that we know what he is actually protecting." That evening, I wrote the longest letter I had written since my 2 years of fighting lawyers in Boston. I wrote to Archer Hayes in Amarillo with the same care I brought to a difficult repair job, every fact in its correct order, every connection made explicit, every piece of supporting information named. At midnight, Ryder came to the kitchen where I was finishing. He read what I had written. He did not change a word. He said, "You should have been a lawyer." I said, "My father needed a cobbler. I became what he needed." He said, "And now?" I said, "Now I think I am exactly what I am supposed to be. Here." He looked at me for a moment. Then he reached out and touched my face, one brief, careful touch, the back of his hand along my jaw. I said nothing. He said, "In the morning we move Emmy to Maggie's. She will be safer in town where there are people around." I said, "Agreed." He said, "And then we wait for Hayes." I said, "And then we wait." 2 days later, a county notice arrived at the ranch by formal courier. A lien from 1864 on the eastern 200 acres, the same pattern, the same handwriting on the form, the same land holding company in Denver. Ryder read it and set it on the pile with the others. He said, "He is accelerating." I said, "Because we are." The same afternoon, Cole came to the ranch in person. He came alone, which surprised me. He dismounted in the yard and walked to the door with his silver smile and his impeccable coat, and the particular patience of a man who has always been able to wait out other people's resistance. I opened the door. He said, "Miss Weston, I hope I'm not interrupting." I said, "You are. Come in." He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had laid out everything to Ryder the night before. I remained standing. He said, "I want to help you, and your husband. This land situation is genuinely complicated. I have influence over how certain claims proceed. I would hate to see the Callahan Ranch caught up in proceedings that a little cooperation could prevent." He was very good. The warmth was constructed, but constructed skillfully. I said, "Judge Cole, when I was 19 years old, a man came into my father's shop and told him that the situation with our building was complicated, but that a little cooperation could prevent a great deal of hardship. My father cooperated. For 4 years he cooperated. Then the building was taken anyway because the cooperation was never the point." I looked at him. I said, "I hear exactly what you are saying. And the answer is no. It was no before you arrived. It will be no when you leave." He was still for a moment. The pleasant expression did not change, which was more telling than if it had. He said, "You are making a significant mistake." I said, "Possibly. I have made them before. They had the courtesy to look like mistakes. This does not." He stood. He put on his hat. He said, "Ryder should know that my patience has limits." I said, "Ryder knows everything I know." Cole left. I stood in the quiet of the kitchen and listened to his horse cross the yard. Then I sat down at my bench and picked up the harness strap I had been working on. And I found the stitch I had stopped at. And I finished it. The stitch held. It always held when you did it right. Archer Hayes arrived on the Wednesday stage. He was a compact, direct man of about 50, who shook hands like someone who had been doing it professionally for a long time and had no patience for its ceremonial aspects. He read my letter on the stage from Amarillo and had 3 questions ready when he stepped onto the platform. I answered them in the wagon on the way to Maggie's boarding house. Maggie's back room held 14 people that evening. Every family with a county notice. Dallas Reed, Ryder, and Hayes at the head of the table with the letter I had sent him and 2 additional documents he had sourced on his own in Amarillo. I stood at the front of the room. I said, "Judge Warren Cole is not after your land. He has never been after your land. The land is leverage, a way to keep you isolated and frightened and looking inward so you do not look at him. What he is actually protecting is his record, specifically the murder of George Aldridge in 1871, which was witnessed by a child who is now 8 years old and who has recently begun to speak again. The room shifted. Hayes said, "I have a warrant drafted. I need signed statements from each of you describing your interactions with Cole or with his holding company. I need them tonight." Then I ride to Cole's residence at first light. People gave their statements for 2 hours. I moved around the room quietly, refilling coffee, watching faces. I watched George Alcott's posture change as the session went on. The defensive hunch he had carried for months slowly straightening as he understood that what had been done to him had a name, and the name could be spoken in a courtroom. I watched Hank Morris grip his wife's hand across the table. I watched Ryder, who was the most contained person in the room. The way he always was, but whose hands, braced on his thighs when the meeting started, gradually settled when Hayes laid out the legal strategy. At the end, when Hayes closed his notebook, he said, "The Callahan Ranch. I need additional security there tonight. Cole will know by morning that this meeting happened." Ryder said, "We will be ready." We rode back in the dark. Emmy was at Maggie's, safe. The ranch was quiet. On the porch, Ryder and I stood side by side in the cold night air. He said, "I want to tell you something. Before tomorrow." I said, "All right." He said, "I chose you off a list because I needed someone practical who had nowhere to run. That is true, and I will not spend the rest of my life pretending it is not. But here is the other thing that is true. From the first morning you sat down at that bench and worked instead of talking. From the first time you said exactly the right thing to Emmy, and then did not follow it up by saying anything else. From the first time you laughed on the back of that horse, I have been trying to find the words for what I saw, and I cannot. But I know what it is. I know what I am asking you to stay for, and it is not practicality." I said, "Ryder." He said, "I know I do not deserve it. I know I have given you 3 separate reasons to leave and you have not left. And I do not know what to do with that except to stand here and tell you plainly that I do not want you to leave, that I want you to stay, not because Emmy needs you, though she does, but because I do." He touched the brim of his hat. Then he stopped reaching for the gesture and instead reached for my hand. He said, "In the morning I will say whatever else needs saying, but I wanted you to know that tonight, in case tomorrow goes wrong." I said, "It will not go wrong." He said, "I know, but still." I held his hand. We stood like that until the cold pushed us inside. At 3 in the morning I heard horses, not 1, 3. I was at the window before Ryder reached the door. 4 men in the yard, Cole in front, in a coat he had thrown over his nightclothes, his silver hair undone. 3 men behind him, and Dallas Reed at his side. Ryder opened the door. He looked at Dallas. His face did the thing it did. Not surprise. The specific pain of a thing you suspected and would have given anything to have been wrong about. Cole said, "I need the girl brought out, for her protection. There are concerns about the company she's keeping." Ryder said, "No." Cole said, "Dallas." Dallas did not move. Cole, quieter, said his name again. Dallas said, "No." He stepped sideways, away from Cole. He turned his rifle on Cole's men. He said, "I have been paying a debt to you for 4 years, a debt I made because I was young and afraid and you were in a position to ruin me. I am done paying it. You can ruin me. I will take whatever comes. But I am not going into that house to bring out a child so you can silence her." Cole's face, the pleasantness gone. Not dramatically, just gone, the way color leaves leather when it dries completely out. He said, "Shoot them." The man on Cole's right raised his rifle. I had the shotgun from inside the door. I stepped out onto the porch. My hands were steady. Ryder had taught me to shoot over 3 evenings in the East Field. I had been a poor student the first evening, and a decent one by the 3rd. I thought about that, standing on the porch in the dark. The man on Cole's right looked at me, at the shotgun, at my hands. He lowered his rifle 6 inches. Dallas disarmed the man on Cole's left in about 3 seconds. Ryder came off the porch for the third man with the particular efficiency of a man who had spent years in situations where speed was the difference between living and not. Cole ran for his horse. I fired the shotgun into the ground in front of the horse. The horse stopped. Cole did not get away. Dallas sat down in the dirt of the yard and put his hands on top of his head. He looked at Ryder. He said, "How long have you known?" Ryder said, "A while." Dallas said, "I tried to protect you. I told myself that was what I was doing." Ryder said, "I know." Dallas said, "I was wrong. Ryder looked at his oldest friend for a long moment. He said, "You turned when it mattered. I see that. I am holding both things at the same time." Hayes arrived with 2 deputies within the hour. Cole left Coldwater in irons as the sun came up. Emmy was brought from Maggie's at mid-morning. She walked into the yard and went straight to me, put both arms around my waist, then reached one hand out for her father. 3 people in the yard in the morning light. The sky was doing something I had not seen since arriving in Texas. Clouds moving in from the northwest. Real clouds, the kind with weight in them. The first clouds in 2 years. Ryder put his arm around my shoulders. I leaned into him. Emmy looked up at both of us and said in her small new voice, "Is it going to rain?" Ryder said, "I believe it is." She said, "Good. The horses like it." We stood there until the first drops came down. Cole was convicted on 4 federal counts the following spring. Murder of George Aldridge. Obstruction of a federal investigation, conspiracy to intimidate a minor witness, abuse of judicial authority for private financial gain. His federal appointment was revoked before the ink on the charges dried. He was sentenced to 15 years and left Coldwater for the last time in the custody of 2 federal marshals on a Tuesday morning in March. The town watched from the sidewalks. Nobody said anything. The silence was not shock. It was recognition. Every county notice filed through Cole's holding company was voided by federal court order. The families who had received them were notified by letter, then in person by Hayes, who rode the circuit himself because he believed that good news delivered in writing did not land the same way as good news delivered face-to-face. Hank Morris came to the ranch when he received his letter. He gripped both my hands and could not find words for a full minute. Then he said, "My father built that land. My son's going to have it." I said, "Yes, he is." Dallas Reed cooperated with the federal investigation fully and received a reduced sentence. 18 months. Ryder did not write to him in prison. He also did not stop the small gift that arrived at Maggie's on Emmy's birthday each year, sent on Dallas's behalf, unsigned, a book of drawing paper and good pencils, until Dallas could send it himself. This was how Ryder expressed things that did not have language. Victoria Harlow opened a hat shop on Main Street with money she had been saving for years. She nodded to me when we passed on the street. I nodded back. It was an uncomplicated piece, which is the best kind. Maggie Ford came to dinner at the ranch every Sunday from November onward. She brought something different each time and argued with Emmy about which cup was the right cup for hot chocolate. An argument Emmy won every single time, and they both knew it, and they both kept having it. The land mended. The first real rain of autumn was followed by a second and a third, and the cracked earth of Coldwater began, slowly and with some reluctance, to soften. 2 months after Cole's arrest on a Saturday morning, Emmy came downstairs in her best dress. She was wearing her mother's Sunday boots, the ones from the cedar chest, the dark brown ones with the detached left heel, the ones I had repaired over 3 nights in secret, working by lamplight after the house was asleep, taking the heel block apart and resetting it with brass ring nails and restitching the full welt. I had not told anyone. I had put them back in the cedar chest and said nothing. Ryder saw them from across the kitchen. He went completely still. Emmy looked at me. I looked at her. She was waiting to see if she had done the right thing. I said, "They fit?" She said, "They fit perfectly." Ryder turned away, one hand on the doorframe, his shoulders doing the thing they did when something was too large for the room. I crossed the kitchen and put my hand on his back. I did not say anything. I did not. I had learned by then when words were needed and when they were not. After a moment, he turned around. His eyes were bright in the way of a man who has not cried in a very long time and is not going to do it now, but is also not going to pretend he is not close to it. He said, "You repaired them." I said, "Yes." He said, "When?" I said, "A while ago." I was not sure it was my place, but I could not leave them the way they were. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Clara." He said my name the way he said things that mattered, simply, without anything extra. Then he said, "Marry me, not because Emmy needs you, not because the ranch needs you, because I need you, because I am a better man when you are in the room, and I would like to spend however many years I have left, proving that I understand the difference between what you are worth and what I offered you that first day on the platform." I said, "You have been proving it for 4 months." He said, "Then let me keep proving it, officially." I said, "Yes." The wedding was 3 weeks later. Maggie officiated because the church was cold and Maggie's parlor had better coffee, and, as Maggie pointed out, she had been present for the beginning of it and she intended to be present for the formalization. Emmy stood between us during the vows, holding one hand from each of us, in her mother's repaired boots and a new dress she had chosen herself, green because green was her favorite, and she had recently decided to state her preferences clearly, which was a development Ryder and I both found unreservedly wonderful. Ryder's vow was 12 words long. He had written it on a scrap of paper and memorized it. He said, "I will be here. Every morning, I will be here." I said, "I spent a long time thinking that love was a promise. I know now that it is a habit, a daily choice to show up and do the work. I am choosing that habit, with you, for every day I have." At the end, in the quiet after Maggie pronounced us, Emmy looked up at me. She said, "You are staying." I said, "I am staying." She leaned into my side. I put my arm around her. Ryder put his arm around both of us. Outside, the November sky over the Texas Panhandle was doing something extraordinary, the kind of sunset that only happens in that particular country, a spectrum of colors that had no names in any language I knew, that existed only in this place at this hour, in a light that seemed to arrive from somewhere past the horizon and stay longer than it had any physical reason to. I had come west with a tool case and a carpet bag, and the working theory that wanting things was how you got hurt. I had been right and I had been wrong. Wanting the wrong things from the wrong people for the wrong reasons, that is how you get hurt. Wanting something real, something that has been through weather and work, and has been properly maintained through all of it, that is different. My father used to say, "Do not look at a man's new boots, look at his old ones. The old ones tell you the truth about who he is and where he has been willing to go." I looked at Ryder Callahan's boots the first day I arrived at this ranch. Old, worn through at the toe, resoled carefully by someone who knew what they were doing. Kept past when most men would have replaced them. He keeps what he values. I know that now. I know it because he kept me. Emmy was asleep by the time the last guests left. Ryder carried her upstairs in her good dress and her mother's repaired boots and laid her on her bed and pulled the quilt up and stood in her doorway for a moment the way parents stand in doorways. Then he came back downstairs. I was at my bench under the south window, putting my tools back in their proper places, the awls in the leather roll, the lasting pliers on their hooks, the curved needle for uppers, everything where it belonged. Ryder leaned in the doorway between the hall and the main room and watched me. I said, "You're going to lean on that door frame until the wood gives." He said, "It is good wood. I built the frame myself." I said, "Of course you did." He crossed the room and stood behind me, his hands on my shoulders, his chin resting on top of my head. I said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "Tell me." I said, "The day I arrived, standing on that platform. I had been trying, for 2 years, not to need anything, not to want anything. I had gotten quite good at it. And then you walked up and said you would never stand in a crowd and find me wanting. And something in me that I had been holding shut for a very long time opened up just enough to say yes. He said nothing, just listened. I said, I did not know what I was saying yes to. I thought I was saying yes to a roof and fair treatment and a man who was honest about his limitations, and I was. But I was also saying yes to a child who draws people without mouths and presses notes under doors, and walked 4 miles into town to show me a drawing that said home. He held me tighter. I said I was saying yes to a man who fixes chair rungs without being asked, and leaves leather oil on front steps and touches the brim of his hat when he is feeling something he does not have words for. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I said I was saying yes to a place that was trying, in its own unhurried way, to become mine. And it has. Outside, the night wind moved off the plains and pressed against the windows, and the lamp on my workbench made a circle of light that held us both. Coldwater was dark and quiet. The Callahan Ridge was dark and quiet. The fencing was straight, the gates were hung true, and somewhere upstairs a child who had decided that speaking was worth the risk was asleep in a green dress and her mother's repaired boots. My father had been right about leather. The strongest piece is not the one that has never been tested. It is the one that has been through weather and work and been properly maintained despite all of it. The one that has been repaired by someone who understood where the failure began and what it needed to hold. That leather, he said, is the leather that holds when you need it most. Stitch by careful stitch. That is how everything worth keeping is built. Not all at once, not without cost, but with patient hands and honest work and the daily choice to show up and do it right. I had come west with nothing but my father's tools. I had built a life. It was holding. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
The story of Clara Weston and Ryder Callahan is, at its heart, a quiet but powerful reflection on resilience, trust, and the true nature of love. Set against the harsh yet honest landscape of the American West, it explores how people who have been broken by life can still rebuild something meaningful slowly, carefully, and with intention. One of the central meanings of the story is that strength is not about never being wounded, but about learning how to endure and rebuild after hardship. Clara arrives in Coldwater, carrying emotional scars from loss, betrayal, and survival. She believes that wanting anything will only lead to pain. Yet, through her journey, we see that shutting oneself off is not true strength. True strength lies in the courage to risk connection again, even when the past has given every reason not to. Another key theme is the difference between being needed and being truly valued. At first, Clara is chosen by Ryder for practical reasons: her skills, her independence, and her lack of ties. This creates tension because she fears being reduced to usefulness rather than being seen as a person. However, as the story unfolds, Ryder grows, learns, and begins to recognize her worth beyond function. The moral lesson here is that relationships built only on necessity are incomplete. Real human connection requires recognition, respect, and emotional honesty. The story also teaches us that trust is not built through words, but through consistent actions over time. Ryder does not express himself easily, yet his quiet acts repairing things, leaving supplies, protecting Clara and Emmy, gradually build a foundation of trust. Similarly, Clara earns Emmy's trust not by forcing affection, but by being patient and steady. This reflects an important life lesson. Trust cannot be demanded or rushed. It must be earned through reliability and care. Perhaps the most profound moral lesson is about forgiveness. Clara discovers that Ryder is responsible for her brother's death, an unimaginable revelation. Yet the story does not present forgiveness as immediate or easy. Instead, it shows that forgiveness is a process, a conscious decision that may come before the feeling itself. As Maggie wisely says, forgiveness is something you decide first. The feeling catches up later. This highlights that forgiveness is not about forgetting or excusing wrongs, but about choosing not to let pain define the future. The character of Emmy adds another layer of meaning. Her silence represents trauma, fear, and the instinct to protect oneself. Her gradual return to speech symbolizes healing and the power of a safe, loving environment. Through her, the story teaches that healing often happens quietly, and it requires patience, understanding, and emotional safety. Finally, the story emphasizes that love is not a grand declaration, but a daily commitment. Clara herself reflects that love is not a promise, but a habit, the habit of showing up, doing the work, and choosing each other every day. This is perhaps the most important message. Real love is built over time, through effort, honesty, and shared resilience. In conclusion, this story is not just about survival in a harsh land, but about emotional survival and renewal. It reminds us that even after loss, betrayal, and pain, it is still possible to build something lasting, stitch by careful stitch. The moral lesson is clear. Life will test us, but with patience, integrity, and the courage to trust again, we can create a life that truly holds.